Chapter 8. The Phillips Curve, the Natural Rate of Unemployment, and Inflation. Learning objectives. Understand the relation between inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment. Know the original and the augmented Phillips curve. Know what is meant by the natural rate of unemployment. Chapter 8 Outline. The Phillips curve, the natural rate of unemployment, and inflation. 8-1 Inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment. 8-2 The Phillips curve and its mutations. 8-3 The Phillips curve and the natural rate of unemployment. 8-4 A summary and many warnings. In 1958, A.W. Phillips found a negative relation between inflation and unemployment. 2 years later, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow labeled this relation the Phillips curve, which became central to macroeconomic thinking and policy. Figure 8-1 shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment in the United States for the years 1900 to 1960. During the period 1900 to 1960 in the United States, a low unemployment rate was typically associated with a high inflation rate, and a high unemployment rate was typically associated with a low or negative inflation rate. 8-1 Inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment. Equation 7.1 is the weight-setting relation from Chapter 7. Equation 7.3 is the price-setting relation from Chapter 7. By substituting equation 7.1 in equation 7.3, we get an equation showing the relation between price level, expected price level, and unemployment. Equation 8.1 shows relation between price level P, expected price level PE, and unemployment U after assuming a specific form for the function showing relation of wage setting and unemployment. Equation 8.2 shows the relation between inflation rate, expected inflation rate, and unemployment. How to go from equation 8.1 to 8.2 is shown in the appendix to this chapter in the textbook. Equation 8.2 says inflation rate pi depends on expected inflation rate pi e, markup m, catch-all variable z, constant alpha, and unemployment rate u. Implications of equation 8.2. An increase in pi e leads to an increase in pi. Given pi e, an increase in m or an increase in z leads to an increase in pi. Given pi e, a decrease in u leads to an increase in pi. Equation 8.3 is the same as equation 8.2 with a time index t. 8-2 The Phillips curve and its mutations. Assume pi et equals pi bar equals 0 so that equation 8.3 becomes equation 8.4. Pi t equals m plus z minus alpha ut, which is a negative relation between unemployment and inflation. This Phillips curve relation was observed in the United States in the 1960s. The relation vanished in the 1970s because wage setters changed the way they formed inflation expectations. Figure 8-2 shows the negative relation between inflation and unemployment that was observed in the United States from 1948 to 1969. The steady decline in the U.S. unemployment rate throughout the 1960s was associated with a steady increase in the inflation rate. Figure 8-3 shows the behavior of unemployment versus inflation in the United States from 1970 to 2010. Beginning in 1970 in the United States, the relation between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate disappeared because wage setters changed the way they formed inflation expectations. Equation 8.5 shows the impact of how expectations about inflation are formed on the relation between unemployment rate and inflation rate. When people believe inflation will be equal to some constant, then there is an inverse relation between inflation and unemployment. This was true in the US up to the end of 1960s, where inflation was up in some years and down in the others, on average prices remaining constant with inflation rate near zero. When inflation expectations are such that inflation this year is expected to be equal to inflation last year, then the unemployment rate affects not the inflation rate but rather the change in the inflation rate. This was true in the 1970s when inflation kept rising and people started to believe inflation in each year was going to be positive. Figure 8-4 shows the modified Phillips curve relation. Since 1970, there has been a negative relation between the unemployment rate and the change in the inflation rate in the United States. Equation 8.7 shows the modified Phillips curve, or the expectations augmented Phillips curve, or the accelerated Phillips curve relation for the period 1974 to 2004. It shows a negative relation between unemployment rate and change in inflation rate, as opposed to the original Phillips curve relation between unemployment rate and inflation rate. In the medium run, after all prices adjust, economy returns to the natural rate of unemployment. By definition, in the medium run, actual inflation rate is equal to the expected inflation rate. Pi equals pi e. The natural rate of unemployment is defined as the unemployment rate needed to keep inflation rate constant. Natural rate of unemployment is consistent with change in inflation being equal to zero. Equation 8.8 tells us that the natural rate of unemployment depends on the magnitude of parameters m, z, and alpha. It does not depend on the inflation rate. Equation 8.9 gives us another way of looking at the relation between inflation and unemployment. Difference between actual and expected inflation is negatively related to the difference between actual unemployment and natural unemployment. Equation 8.10 shows if expected inflation rate pi e is well approximated by pi t minus 1, then the relation between unemployment and inflation in the United States today is well captured by a relation between the change in inflation rate and the deviation of the unemployment rate from the natural rate of unemployment. When the unemployment rate is below the natural rate of unemployment, the inflation rate typically increases. The natural rate of unemployment differs across countries due to, example, labor market rigidities and also over time. When the actual unemployment rate UT is equal to the natural rate of unemployment UN, change in inflation pi t minus 1 equals 0. So the natural rate of unemployment is also called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, NAIRU. Focused theory ahead of facts. Milton, Friedman, and Edmund Phelps. Milton, Friedman, and Edmund Phelps argued that the trade-off between inflation and unemployment in the late 1960s was an illusion. Accordingly, the Phillips curve is a temporary rather than a permanent trade-off between inflation and unemployment that comes not from inflation per se, but from a rising rate of inflation which results in unanticipated inflation. They questioned the trade-off on logical grounds, arguing that such a trade-off could only exist if wage setters systematically underpredicted inflation and that they were unlikely to make the same mistake forever. Focus. What explains European unemployment? Factors for labor market rigidities. A generous system of unemployment insurance. A high degree of employment protection. Minimum wages. Bargaining rules such as extension agreements. Key facts of unemployment in Europe. Unemployment was not always high. Some European countries actually had low unemployment prior to the start of the current crisis. Figure 1 shows unemployment rates in 15 European countries in 2006, the year in which inflation was stable, implying the unemployment rate was equal to its natural rate. In some European countries such as France, Spain, Germany, Greece, and Belgium, unemployment was high, but in some other European countries such as Ireland, Netherlands, and Denmark, the unemployment rate was quite low. Focus. Changes in the U.S. natural rate of unemployment since 1990. Possible explanations for the decrease of the U.S. natural rate of unemployment from 7 to 8% in the 1980s to about 5% today. Increased globalization and stronger competition between U.S. and foreign firms may have lowered the markup. Increases in employment by temporary help agencies. The aging U.S. population and a decrease in the proportion of young workers and thus the unemployment rate. An increase in the incarceration rate. The increase in the number of workers on disability. 8-4. Summary and many warnings. When the inflation rate becomes high, the terms of wage agreements tend to change with the level of inflation. Wage indexation is a provision that automatically increases wages in line with inflation. Suppose lambda indicates the proportion of labor contracts that is indexed, so nominal wages move 1-for-1 with changes in the actual price level. Equation 8.9 becomes equation 8.11. When lambda equals 0, equation 8.11 becomes equation 8.10. When lambda is greater than 0, equation 8.11 shows the higher the proportion of contracts that are indexed, larger is the value of the coefficient showing effect of difference between actual unemployment and natural level of unemployment on change in inflation rate. In the extreme case, almost no change in unemployment can lead to large changes in inflation. This is what happens in countries where inflation is high. 8-4. A summary and many warnings. When low inflation or deflation occurs, the Phillips curve relation breaks down. One possible reason is the reluctance of workers to accept cuts in nominal wages. When expected inflation is close to 0, the modified Phillips curve relation breaks down. High unemployment during the crisis did not lead to decrease in inflation. Similarly, now when unemployment is low, it is not leading to steadily increasing inflation. Original Phillips curve seems to be more relevant, showing relation between unemployment rate and level of inflation.